It's time for the Bible Geek. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, baby, God, blasphemy, Ghost, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Time for the Bible Geek again already. Yes, it's me, Robert M. Price. Before I dive back into my latest book I'm working on, Holy Fable, I wanted to chew through some more of those good questions. And first, I'd like to just add something to a couple of questions I dealt with on the last couple of shows. It did not occur to me at the time. Reuven asked, I tried to find the email again and I couldn't, but Reuven asked about the story of a particular Hasidic rabbi who was said to have taught Torah to God, and asked what on earth one might make of this. I didn't quite, for some reason, I didn't catch the wording of his question right, and I think now what he was, well, that what I just said was the gist of it. I somehow thought he meant something else. What would it mean for his followers to say that a Hasidic rabbi was teaching God the Torah? Well, I thought about it a little bit, and it occurred to me that it might have something to do, or at least be part of the same thought world as an early story we have somewhere in the Mishnah. I'm sure Reuven would know it instantly, where you have Rabbi Eliezer, who was always sort of a maverick, not exactly a heretic. Plenty of his opinions are preserved in the Mishnah, even though he's always not the one to go with. But I don't know, it's a fascinating thing. Anyway, he's at Yavna, and there's a debate going on as to whether whether an oven should be, I could be wrong, but it's some technicality like this, whether an oven ought to be considered a multi-piece item or a single item, because it's, different plates forged together and so on. It seems like an awful technicality if you're not in that game, but I don't even remember who took what view. It doesn't matter for what I'm getting at. Eliezer took one view and everybody else in the Sanhedrin took the other. And Eliezer refused to concede. And he said, look, if I am right, may the tree outside attest it, and the tree uproots itself and walks some distance and re-roots itself. And the sages say, I'm sorry, the trees have nothing to do with the issue. And okay, if I am right, may the river outside attest it. And the river changes course miraculously. And says, no, nothing doing. Rivers don't have anything to say on this issue. And then he says, okay, if I am right, let the walls of this house of study attest it. And what do you know? The bricks in the wall begin to collapse. They start leaning over in respect to Rabbi Eliezer, but in respect to the rest of the sages assembled there, it doesn't fall down completely. So it's sort of suspended in a falling arc. You'd think this might impress him, but no. The Sanhedrin says, I'm sorry, the walls don't have anything to say on this issue. And he says, okay, if I am right, may the Almighty himself attest it. Well, what do you know? Here comes the big booming voice, and it says, Rabbi Eliezer is correct. Now, what's the reaction this time? The head of the Sanhedrin sort of shakes his finger at the sky and says, I'm sorry, we go by the Torah, not by heavenly voices. And then they hear the voice again and says, my children have defeated me. How interesting. This is a profound story about a religion based on Scripture and the collective wisdom of its interpreters, as opposed to special effects, supposed new revelations. Very fascinating. Of course, it's drawn in extreme terms to make that as clear as possible. Okay, I have a hunch that maybe this has something to do with the acclamation of that rabbi who can even teach God. How's he teaching him? Well, some of the early Hasids weren't that slavishly bound to the text and were more charismatic figures, and certainly Hasidic rabbis remain that way, but since the beginning they have integrated incredible fidelity to the letter of the Torah and the Talmud and so on. So I have a hunch it's something like that. If it's not, I don't know. I'd never heard of this rabbi. I can't even think of his name now. But I also think of Meister Eckhart, who said, God needs me to worship him. He's not God without worshipers. And somehow this idea that since God created man, man is essential to God. That might have something to do with that, but I can't really get into it deeper. I don't know enough to suggest what was the issue there, only what might have been. Okay, another thing, someone asked just last time, or I got to the question last time, about Margaret Barker's observation that when this passage about the sun, S-U-N, rising with healing in its wings, that Margaret Barker points out that's not the pronoun, it's in her wings. And she says, well, this is a remnant of the worship of goddesses in ancient Israelite religion that never really went out of style, though it was officially banned. But this is one of the loose ends that the editors of the Bible did not manage to catch. But translators of the Bible do, because they usually translate its wings, or even his wings, based on the Christian belief that this is a prediction of Jesus. Well, the questioner said, do I think she's right? Is there anything to that, the fact that the female pronoun is used? And I basically just copped out and said, well, I think Margaret Barker usually is right, and this does sound like one of the many loose ends in the Bible attesting an earlier state of affairs they sought to suppress. But it just suddenly occurred to me yesterday, while I was waiting for my daughter at the Food Lion, that there's more to it than that. This has to be a reference to Shahar, the goddess of the dawn. If I take the wings of Shahar and fly to the uttermost parts of the earth, even there you'll find me, and so on. Shahar is mentioned a couple of times, the dawn goddess with wings, right? That's the before the sun actually rises, you see the beautiful colors coming up over the horizon, and that's the wings of Shahar. Well, certainly that's what we have here, the rising sun, the healing sun, S-U-N, with wings has got to be the goddess Shahar. So yeah, I haven't read Barker recently enough to remember if that's the point she makes. I suspect it is, but even if it isn't, it shows that she's right. It does indicate polytheism and so forth. So I figured I needed to revisit those two quick. Let's see. Here's one from the Big Blue Frog. He says, "Dear Sideshow Bob," of course you remember who that is, right, from The Simpsons. I always liked him. "I'm an atheist, but I have a soft spot for elements of Zen Buddhism and Taoism. Sometimes I even like parts of them that contradict, and there's much contradictory teaching in Zen and Taoism. What I'd like to know is whether there are parallels between either Zen and Christianity or Taoism and Christianity, and whether these are borrowings or simply convergent evolution." I don't think of any doctrinal parallels. They seem to really go in opposite directions. Like in Zen, the indifference toward traditional forms and even doctrines is hard to find a parallel with in Christianity. It's not that Christianity has never taught deeper knowledge like Gnosticism did and so forth, but it doesn't dispense with traditional Christianity as the path to deeper knowledge, whereas Zen says, who really needs it? If the old ways aren't working for you, forget it and do something else to jolt you out of your complacency. And the great example of that would be the parable of the raft, one of my favorite parables. A guy is fleeing from an angry mob, and he comes to the shore of a wide, deep river that he cannot wade or swim across. I think there's even crocodiles in it, maybe. But he knows he's got to do something, and so he has enough of a head start that he's got time to take some of the, I suppose, broken off or rotten logs, there are plenty of those, and tie them together with vines and make a raft, and he poles across the river just in time. He reaches the other side of the river as the mob reaches the former side of the river, and they look around and they're baffled, and he gets away. The Buddha says, suppose you're that guy. Would you carry the raft around on your back like a tortoise shell forever in gratitude for it? It did save your life. But no, you wouldn't do that. Well, it's the same way with the Dharma, with the doctrine. If it got you across good to the farther shore, that is, if it got you enlightened, you don't need it anymore. And that's so to heck with it. Hence the famous Buddhist iconography of the monk tearing the scroll of Scripture apart. Who needs it? Right? I did need it, and it did its job, so why do I need it anymore? If a doctor prescribes medicine and it cures me, I don't keep taking the medicine, right? So why should you continue in the practice of a religion that did its job? Same thing with Shankara in Hinduism. I don't need to sing hymns or pray anymore now that I've realized my oneness with the Brahman. I think that may be involved in the Gospel of Thomas. How should we pray? How should we fast and give alms? And Jesus says, if you pray, you will be damned. If you fast, you will do harm to your souls, etc. I have a hunch that's because of the old wineskins, new wine thing. These things were preparatory to a reality that has now arrived. So yeah, there are parallels, but most Christians believe they will never get to the point of not needing Scripture anymore, and to displace Scripture, which Zen also says. That's why they came up with the koans, the contradictions, baffling puzzles that have no real logical answer, that are just trying to make you come to the end of the logical rope and then just be shocked into awareness once you do give up any traditional route, and that you attain satori. Well, that has popped up, I guess, in like in the Gospel of Thomas, if I'm even right on interpreting it that way. But generally, I mean, both of them have mysticism, but that's no news to you. However, this shock tactic thing with being jolted into satori, there's a whole mess of Zen anecdotes where a novice is impatient. He wants to learn Zen, and since you can't really learn it, and the abbot knows that, because words, well, talk doesn't cook the rice. These words about enlightenment can be taken as substitutes for it. I understand the doctrine, so I guess I'm enlightened. No, you are not. So they say, look, let's just forget that, and they'll slap the seeker in the face or some such thing, and it's like to jolt you into enlightenment. Well, in a really fascinating book called Lost Christianity by Jacob Needleman, he says that it always seems to work that way, that if you're going to get to the deeper power current running underneath Christianity, you have to be knocked over. You have to be put in some extreme emotional or physical situation where your armor has cracked and fallen away, and now the experience of the Spirit can get past it, and lightning strikes. Very interesting, the approach of enlightenment by means of being rendered uncomfortable and even desperate. That's a similarity, and maybe the main one. I notice you adroitly ask about parallels between Zen and Christianity, because if you go with just general Mahayana Buddhism, there's huge numbers of parallels, but Zen is a whole different beast. With Taoism, I'm not sure I see parallels there. It is ultimately a kind of complementary dualism, whereas you don't have that in Christianity, where it's more of a combative dualism like Zoroastrianism, from which it came. So I would say you'd probably enjoy Needleman's Lost Christianity. He was a Gurdjieff follower and brings a very interesting perspective to Christianity. I had the great privilege of hearing him speak in the classroom at Harvard Divinity School the semester I took a course there, Heresies, Ancient and Modern, team taught by Helmut Kester and Harvey Cox. I thought that was already mind-blowing, but then they brought in their buddy Needleman to talk one day. I thought, oh man, I have reached academic nirvana. Anyhow, Big Blue Frog, hope that's somewhat helpful. Scott DiGregorio, Commander Scotty, says, can you share your thoughts on the origin, structure, and purpose of the Abraham story in Genesis 12 through 22? Like, that's the whole Abraham cycle. Well, I tend to think, let's see here. Let me just pause a second. Okay, the Abraham story, I still go with the notion of, really, there's a whole mess of Abraham origin theories that I think somehow all overlap and represent different stages of its evolution. I tend to think that Ignaz Goldziher, in his great book Mythology Among the Hebrews, is probably right, that Abraham, which means either great father or father of a multitude, is a reference to the moon god, and he was depicted to be the father of the multitude of stars, a favorite god for desert Bedouins because they preferred to be active in the cool of the night rather than the scorching day. Hence the story of Abraham nearly trying to sacrifice Isaac and being unable to carry it through. It's like the moon would like to supplant the sun, but can't finally do it, and it keeps trying, and that's what's going on. Abe's about to stab Ike, who is a sun deity, and then can't do it, and so forth. Well, that though there is an interesting alternative that Giovanni Garbini points out in his terrific book, History and Ideology in Ancient Israel. He says that we have a record outside of the Bible of a Hebrew tribe known as Raham, and that Abraham may well have meant Raham is my father, and that had to do, that was the perhaps imaginary patriarch of that tribe, which melded into Judah and became the imaginary patron of the whole bunch. I don't know, either one would make sense, but since more attaches to the moon imagery, I tend to go with that one. Like all these myths did, they eventually demoted the mythic character, the god, into a legendary patriarch or hero, like Samson was a sun god, so was Elijah, so was Moses. But later on, as Israelite religion evolves toward monotheism, they have to demote these gods to keep them around in any form. Well, the same thing would have happened with Abraham, and when it did, he is suddenly, as Hermann Gunkel pointed out in his great Genesis commentary, why do I keep saying these books are great? Well, they are, right? I learned a whole lot from them, and you will too. He says that Abraham, with the whole Abraham, Isaac, Jacob chain, also Ishmael and Esau and all these guys, Lot, they're all symbolic pseudo-genealogical links that seal the deal when various clans and tribes would ally with one another, either to operate a common shrine, each one taking turns, like the 12 tribes of Israel, and each one is supposed to be descended from one of the sons of Jacob, etc., but these are imaginary too. Well, all of these eponymous or name-bearing ancestor figures are genealogical links, like the Abraham people had nothing to do with the Jacob people. Abraham being more of a southern figure, Jacob and Israel, who were originally separate but united to link two groups, they were in the north, and so some of them have to do with that, who's related to whom, like the fact that Lot is related to Abraham is a way of trying to explain how Israel is related, they have to admit, to the Moabites and Ammonites, whom nonetheless they hate, given the joke made about their incestuous origins. Because they're supposed to be, the Moabites and Ammonites are descended from Lot, and Lot is Abraham's nephew, and so forth. Well, it's all, the genealogy is really a kind of a flow chart of alliances and trading relationships and so forth. So he takes on that function, and various of the stories are told for all these different reasons. And as the Abraham figure and his use evolved, we have like the discernible tree rings in the larger legend. Another important part of it is that Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, later Babylonians. Why is that ever reported? I mean, he's called Abraham the Hebrew right out of the gate. What is the deal with saying he comes to Canaan from Babylon, basically? Well, that, Garbini notes, is probably because this was a story told by Jews in Babylon to claim some kind of rootage there, to say, well, we're really home here. We've actually come home to where our ancestor Abraham was. And of course, this would be very important if you were among the many, many, many Jews who did not go back, quote unquote, to Canaan, to Palestine after the exile. And so it was a kind of a double origin story, and the Exodus story has an element of that too. Very likely that was told by Jews in Ptolemaic Egypt, and by the way, Jews got along there very well, just as they did in Babylon. That was another one of these things to say, well, yeah, the story is that we were from Palestine, but actually we came from here. This is really our home. And so I think those are a lot of the relevant facts and theories about good old Honest Abe. Let's see, I am to read this as Commander Worf. It's from David in Newcastle, Australia. What do you think about liberation theology and the idea that the gospel is literally good news for the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized of this world? Could Jesus really have been concerned about liberating the poor if he thought the end of the world was imminent and the kingdom was at hand? The Klingon kingdom. In fact, if you speed by it, Kingdom of God kind of looks like Klingon of God. But liberation theology is more or less based on the Jesus and the Zealots hypothesis of S.G.F. Brandon, which is a very strong hypothesis, in my opinion. In fact, I've said a bunch of times that if there was a historical Jesus, I think Brandon's pegged him, that he would make the most sense as a revolutionary would-be king and Messiah. I think there are other elements that undermine that, but of course there's evidence that points in a lot of different directions, and that's what makes this whole thing so hard. But it seems to me that though you don't have a liberation theologian does not have to posit Jesus being a violent revolutionary, and some do kind of pull back from that, but still see Jesus as a threat against Rome because of his implicit or explicit opposition to the Roman Empire, like Richard A. Horsley, the late great Chaim Maccabee, and others, that the Romans did have reason from their viewpoint to get rid of Jesus because he was spreading propaganda against Rome, even if he wasn't saying, let's rise up against it. He would have been somewhat like the Dead Sea Scrolls people in that case. But he might have actually taken up the sword, and Brandon points out some pretty intriguing evidence in the Gospels that he did. Well, either way, if you go the Brandon route or the Horsley route, you can certainly base liberation theology on that. That, as Horsley would say, all the technicolor apocalyptic mythology is really a kind of symbolism for a hands-on revolution, such as the Zealots and others engaged in. Horsley doesn't like to associate Jesus with the violent Zealots, so he kind of likes to pretend that Jesus was like Gandhi, and I think he really has to twist Josephus and others to get there, but nonetheless, liberation theology says let's carry on that this worldly mission of Jesus on behalf of the oppressed poor. And again, it's a matter of interpretation, but I think I got a lot of respect for that. I do not have respect for the notion that all theology is mere ideology, that I see liberation theologians arguing, and I have read a bunch of them. Gutierrez, Osman, Alves, Leonardo Boff, John Sobrino, and various others. I think I have a decent grasp of that. And Segundo and others. This is part of the Marxism that attaches to liberation theology, even though they emphatically deny that they're Marxist. Others admit that, like Miranda's Marx and the Bible, for instance. I mean, it's pretty obvious. You don't have to necessarily be a Stalinist, but like Segundo says that the notion of individual rights is a sort of a elitist Western capitalist view. Well, I don't like where that's going, to tell you the truth. I mean, that's like saying that you have to submit yourself and sacrifice yourself to the revolution and its vanguard and all that. I think that's a recipe for tyranny, one of many, of course. But I don't think necessarily that would have to be a part of liberation theology. And so there are things I don't like about it. It does seem to me to reduce religion to politics, which strikes me as a kind of leftist Grand Inquisitor move that lets feed the bourgeoisie whatever they need to hear in order to swallow our propaganda for social struggle, and really they have no real interest in theology beyond what can be useful for that end. I don't want to say every one of them has, but I see these currents pretty strongly in liberation theology, and I don't really care for that. But again, that's not all of liberation theology, but it is a biblical theology. You know why John Dominic Crossan went from his kind of fascinating literary theory approach to the Gospels, his books like Cliffs of Fall, In Fragments, In Parables, and other interesting books. He switched over from that to the historical Jesus studies. Well, he makes Jesus kind of a leftist, literally, community organizer, just like Horsley does, and Horsley happens to be a community organizer. Crossan was disappointed when John Paul kind of put the kibosh on, what was it, the Medellin conference in the early 70s, was it, that kind of gave the blessing to liberation theology. And Pope John Paul II, being a Polish Catholic and seeing what great fun it was living under a communist regime, he didn't buy that and tried to squash it. And that's Crossan didn't like that, and so he figured, this is what I've heard, and I think it's true, he decided to go over to the historical Jesus to say, you see, Jesus was kind of like liberation theology, so maybe you ought to stick with it anyway, fellow Catholics. And interesting phenomenon. I asked him to write an article about what was really going on in that shift, but I think he considers me a kook, and probably right, and never did. So, that's what Worf has to say. Here's Mike from the UK. I have noticed something in Genesis which I feel can undermine some of the apologetics that oppose evolution. In Genesis 3:22, God indicates that Adam must be removed from the garden before he also eats of the tree of life and gains eternal life. Clearly, neither Adam nor Eve have eternal life yet. Neither of them have eaten from that tree. We are able to infer from this that Adam, as he was made, would not have lived forever. That observed, we can say God created Adam as a mortal, and therefore death was part of the way Adam was made. God says in Genesis 1:31 that everything he had made was very good. God approved of man being mortal and designed him to die. Adam sinned against God and had to be punished, but that punishment was not the addition of death to his nature. It was the removal of from the garden and loss of the access to the tree of life. The main impact of this insight undermines certain apologetic claims. Those who take the stance that evolution is in opposition to the Genesis narrative claim that death only entered creation through Adam's sin. Jesus came to save the world and had to die to pay the price for Adam's sin. Because death was a punishment, Christ had to die for our sins so the debt we owed could be paid by Jesus. But if Adam was made with death in his creation, then death was not the punishment. Jesus dying, then, is not to take on our punishment. It is not to pay for our sins, so why did he have to die? Do you see anything in this observation itself that is unsound? Had you heard of this line of thinking before? Are there any apologetics that already tackle this? Would you use this in debates where Christians argue that billions of years of death are incompatible with a deathless pre-fall creation? Okay, let me start by saying I believe this is what the Eastern Orthodox churches think. They say that humans were created mortal, and that it wasn't the result of sin, though they did sin, but that the reason God became incarnate in Christ is that we needed to be delivered from mortality, from corruption, which, as you say, we were made with. And how did his death do that? Well, in Orthodoxy, the notion is that God becomes man so that man might become God, as St. Athanasius put it. That through faith in the sacraments, the immortal divinity, not the nature, but the energies of God, as they say, certain predicates of God, pass from God, the incarnate God, Jesus Christ, to us, Christians, and human beings. And that this, in order to open up that channel for transmission, God had to live a complete human life, which includes death, because real human beings are mortals. And so God incarnate, God as a man, had to die. But he didn't need to stay that way because he is God as well. So that's the reason they don't go in so much for the substitutionary propitiation, expiation business that's more popular in Western theology, both Catholic and Protestant. So yeah, I think this major wing of Christian soteriology does presuppose exactly that. Also, already St. Irenaeus around 180 A.D. and Athanasius, again, the guy said God became man so that man might become God, had a Christological theory of recapitulation, which is really an aspect of the notion that God had to live a full and fully human life. They say that Adam didn't exactly fall. He swerved off the track. He didn't lose anything he had, but he was supposed to mature to Christ-like perfection. And the Tree of Knowledge fiasco caused the train to derail, and that is why we need a second Adam, a last Adam, to come and carry humanity the rest of the way to full maturity, a la the Epistle to the Ephesians. And so again, you have a whole different understanding of what Christ came to do, and it is based on the presupposition of human mortality as created. And seen that way, that is a kind of a better apologetic. It tends to get rid of there's still big problems with it, but it gets rid of some of the worst embarrassments of traditional Western soteriology and atonement doctrine. Now, as to some of the particulars in the story, as you summarize it, we can't really bring in from the priestly creation account of Genesis 1 God's approval of what he had created. That is because the whole Eden thing is part of the Yahwist or J text, epic, whatever. That's chapters 2 through 3. So we don't have the explicit approval by God, though I think it is implicit. Now, the way God created the man. And let's see, did in the Eden story, and that's the only one with the tree of life, right, where they forfeit access to it before they ever get around to eating of it, which then they don't, right? This story does seem to imply that man was created mortal, but that he had free access to the tree of life, which would renew his youth and vigor. This and the other plants in the garden, except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, were open to him, but whose garden was it? It's the garden of the gods, Jehovah, Yahweh, and those to whom he speaks. Behold, the man has become like one of us, and so forth, right? This is the tree of life must be the food that keeps the gods alive. Remember, the ancients believed that gods were born and could die eventually. In Hinduism, eventually they must die and be reincarnated. but gods could die, and they did in the Greek myths and such. And so that that's not one of the differences between humanity and God, right? Both, on my reading of it, needed the renewal of the tree of life, the ambrosia of God. It was so the only prerogative that God didn't want the humans to have was that of knowledge, whatever you make of it, so yeah, humans were created mortal, but then so were the gods, and so they didn't lose immortality that they already had. They lost the opportunity to renew their life and vigor. Originally, God wanted the man to live forever just as he does because he wanted a caretaker for the garden. I mean, that is explicitly the point of Adam. And then he only creates a second one, Eve, because he sees the man as lonely. Neither God or the gods are not there enough of the time to keep him company. And he makes the animals first, thinking that maybe they'll keep him company, but they're no good for that, apparently, because they can't talk, though most of us find cats adequate company, even though they don't. Mine do, but most don't. So then he says, maybe I'll have better luck with a piece of the guy made into another one. And he creates Eve. But apparently he wants them to live forever and doesn't want them to learn to procreate because he doesn't want to fill the world with pesky humans. And if they once they learn to procreate, I think that is what the Tree of Knowledge means, then they can't have immortality because you'll fill the world up with rival gods. And so now that they can do that and propagate a species that will go on and on forever, they can't individually go on and on forever, so he bars access to the tree of life. Is there anything in here about a fall or sin? I think not. As you've heard me say many times, I think this is really a version of the Prometheus myth. It's casting the creator as no real friend of humanity, but a god from an earlier dynasty or something, the serpent, as the champion of humanity. So, okay, there's quite a mouthful, because I got a big mouth, as Ralph Crampton used to say. Let's see, Timothy Williams. What happened to all the stuff, the grain, the money, the meat, the wine, etc., that was offered to Yahweh before the temple was destroyed? It must have been a massive amount of material. Well, yeah, there was this big temple treasury. And when the temple was sacked a couple of times by Pharaoh Shishak and by Nebuchadnezzar, they took away huge amounts of treasure. I don't suppose the priests had any real use for it, unless you're talking about the possibility of a corrupt elite priesthood, which eventually you did have. I mean, the Zealots killed these guys because they saw them as collaborators with Rome. Maybe there was a history of that, I don't know, but the priests ate the offerings, right? They would keep part of the animal. The Torah explicitly says they're to do that. And then burn the rest up to God. And this is the way it worked elsewhere too. Like in 1 Corinthians, they're talking about eating meat offered to idols. What they mean is there was too much meat for them to burn up or to keep to eat themselves. So the temples would sell the extra to the meat market. And the conquerors apparently kept taking it away, but a lot of the money would be used for temple upkeep and to pay the staff, right? These big groups of singers and musicians and doorkeepers, night watchmen, and priests and Levites. So a lot of it, no doubt, was consumed that way, quite legitimately. Here's a few from Reuven. concerning Bartimaeus, specifically the man's name, is not his name clear proof that Mark was Greek and well-educated? For he is clearly supposed to be Plato's Timaeus, the name a fusion of Aramaic, Bar, son of, and Greek is not likely a historical name, and is an invention by Mark. What say you? Well, I don't happen to know how many instances of this name we have. That would really tell the tale. Like Nicodemus is used as a pun. A ruler of the people named Nicodemus, which means ruler of the people. And yet there was a name a Jewish name, Nicodemus, spelled slightly differently, but just as a variant, like Nakdemon and such. Though that was pretty rare, but still it was used. Could be the same thing here, and there are things like Bartholomew. Right, there were plenty of guys named that. Bartholomew, the apostle, was named that. That means son of Ptolemy. And Ptolemy was one of Alexander the Great's generals. It's a Greek name. And Ptolemy became the head of the Ptolemaic Empire, headquartered in Egypt. And the Jews, and again, as I said before, there were lots of Jews in Ptolemaic Egypt, and they got along well there, and so many were named Bartholomew or Bartholomew, and that's a real name, even though it's got the Aramaic prefix. And so it's hard to say. J. Duncan M. Derritt suggested that I suppose, regardless of whether people were named this, at least in Mark, it's a kind of a narrative man name, to use Tsvetan Todorov's term, a character who is named for the role, the only role he plays in his brief stint on stage. And he thinks that Bartimaeus is a pun on Bartemya, son of poverty, because he's a beggar, right? So that could be. But it isn't an either-or thing. It could be created as a pun, or it could just be used as a pun, like Judas Iscariot. Judas, I think it's pretty obvious that he's supposed to represent Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, and thus betrayed Jesus in the plan of salvation. But there were plenty of Jews named Judas, right? Judah, same thing. So, it can function that way, but not originate that way. And there were these half Aramaic, half Greek names. Okay, another one. He says, concerning Rufinus of Aquileia and the Didache, specifically Rufinus's mention of the book as the Judgment of Peter. Apparently that's his title, right? Based on what we know of the Didache's transmission. Now, you know what that is, everybody, right? It means the teaching, and the whole name of the thing is the teaching of the 12 apostles to the nations. And it's a church manual, apparently written in Syria, in Greek, and it was probably written in the late 1st, early 2nd century, which is not all that late in our terms, since the Gospels were written about then too. According to Edgar J. Goodspeed, it was based on an earlier document that we have in Latin called the Doctrina. Anyway, so that's kind of basically what it is. And it has valuable stuff, earlier versions of the Eucharistic prayer and information about the wandering apostles and such. Okay, based on what we know of the Didache's transmission, he would have had access, Rufinus would have had access to a complete copy. How then could he possibly tie the work to Peter, and what judgment does the book, I guess, does it refer to? I think I'm missing a couple of words here. In the book of James 1:1, we read, James, a bond servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. What do we make of the phrase 12 tribes who were dispersed abroad? Does this not suggest that the Romans had already destroyed Jewish sovereignty for the last 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, thus confessing the work is not written by James, the brother of the Lord, but another James writing later? How do you understand Judicium Petri, the Latin title he gives it? The judgment I don't understand. Judgment is mentioned in it, like judging prophets don't get taken by charlatans. That's in there, but it does seem odd that would be the title of the whole book. Peter is, of course, supposed to be the leader of the apostles, and this is the teaching of the 12 apostles to the nations. So that could be it, and it might be that in an earlier form it was simply attributed to Peter, kind of like in the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, the journeys of Peter, the preachings of Peter. It could be that this was supposed to be a document written by Peter, but it was broadened out to all the apostles. That's a tendency you have in the Gospel of Matthew, where authority, the keys, initially given to Peter alone, a few chapters later are given to all the 12. So it could be that's what happened, though there's no way to know. It could be that Rufinus is talking about a different document. I don't happen to know how much of it he quotes, but if you just have some of the same sentences, it could be that in the Didache go back to some original, like Goodspeed says with the Doctrina. It could be referring to a source of what we know as the Didache. The thing about James, the business of the 12 tribes, I think that could still refer to just the general diaspora, because there were more, I think there were at least 2 or 3 times as many Jews outside of the Holy Land as in it, in the ostensible time of Jesus. So I wouldn't be too sure about that, though it is an interesting possibility. Sharp eye there. This one is from Steve Bowden. And let's see. I have a question about the commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. But shortly after this commandment is given, an ark is made to house the commandments. And on the lid, there are 2 angels sculpted out of gold. Are these angels graven images or not? What I really mean to ask is, what the hell is up with that? I think this is a result of there being multiple differing law codes, some long, some short, that are just jumbled together in Exodus, and in the other books of the Torah. You got the priestly code, the holiness code, the covenant code, aka Book of the Covenant. You got Deuteronomy. You got the 2 decalogues, the moral decalogue in chapter 20 of Exodus, and the ritual decalogue in chapter 34 of Exodus. It's just a hodgepodge of things, and it's no surprise that, number one, they overlap, right? Presumably you wouldn't find the same commandment 2 or 3 times if it were all a unitary law code, and they contradict. And I guess they just figured, since all of them were sacred and used by different groups when they were trying to come up with an ecumenical scripture, they just couldn't leave anything out, and relied on scribes harmonizing and such, just like Bible readers do today. Also, is it right to say that this commandment should be taken as part and parcel of the previous commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me? Even with the two commandments put together, it still seems as if we are commanded to make no drawings or sculptures, even if their use is not intended as an aid to worship. Violations of this commandment are so brazen, like in these other things like the ark, it makes me think I must not be aware of some adjustment to Christian practice in the Scripture, something like Peter's vision of the animals that makes it all right to chow down at Red Lobster, now with 700 locations worldwide. What is the history behind this? Were the early Jews as iconoclastic as some of today's Muslims? How about early Christians? As someone who is now a once-upon-a-time Catholic, now an atheist, I can promise you there is no shortage of statues, paintings, and assorted whatnot in Catholic churches. Do scholars know how such use of imagery was introduced, and if there were debates about it in the early church? There are surmises and speculations. I don't really know all of them, but I know there's a debate over whether the golden calf is supposed to be an image of Yahweh, or there's a myth of origin about it that has been rewritten as the golden calf episode in Exodus, but the cows they're referring to, the young bulls, are the images that appeared in the Israelite northern temples of Dan and Bethel, where as King Jeroboam dedicates them, he says just what Aaron says, behold, Israel, your gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Are these bulls supposed to be images of Yahweh, or are they supposed to be mounts, and God is understood to be invisibly riding on them? Some say that about the Ark of the Covenant, that it's not an image of God, that he is invisibly enthroned there. Well, of course, the cherubs wouldn't be images of God anyway. What about all the iconography? Well, another thing to remember is that I think there are two separate commandments, for one thing. Having gods, and which is not monotheism yet, it's monolatry, right? It says you don't owe anything to any of the other gods because they're not the ones that redeemed you from Egypt. I am, so worship me, not these other bums. And then don't make an image. What for? Well, presumably to worship. But I think that here is what I was about to say a moment ago. The thing to recognize here is that all of the commandments must have been single sentences originally, and some of them still are. Thou shalt do no murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not bear false witness. The ones that have all kinds of specifications, like you shall not covet anything that is thy neighbor's. That's probably the original, but they said not his lawnmower or his CD player or his pet orangutan or his slaves or his wife or anything. That has to be the beginning of the kind of hair splitting we find in the Mishnah, right? Now, what exactly is work? We're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, so what would count as work? And so they have like 39 different categories of work. That's what's going on here. People are embellishing the commandments to try to make the application very specific, as it's the Word of God. You don't want to get anything wrong. And the same thing goes with the images. The original commandment was no longer clear after a while. It said, you shall not make any images for yourself. What? And somebody said, well, okay, let's stipulate. No image of anything on earth, in heaven, under the earth, the Rephaim, your departed ancestors and all that. No, you can't do that. That doesn't really help because it's still ambiguous. You mean I'm not to make images of these entities in order to worship them? Or there's just no three-dimensional art or even two-dimensional art as in Islam. What do you mean? And I'm guessing that is addressed in the Mishnah, but I'm not sufficiently familiar with it. But it's tough to get rid of the ambiguity. Or another famous ambiguous one, though I think it's pretty easily resolved, is you shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain. What does that mean? Well, you know what I think it means. Of course, this is not my own private theory. I've read this somewhere. That it probably meant to not welch on a contract that you had sworn by invoking Yahweh's name you would have done at this price and by this time. It probably means to forbid perjury, where you would invoke the name of Yahweh and say, hey, as Yahweh lives, I did not do so-and-so. Well, you better not say that if you did it, because God will know, and you'll pay for it. So I don't think they felt they had to elaborate that one, though we do know later scribes wondered, well, exactly how do you do this? And some said, magic? And so you have the story in the Toledoth Yeshu that Jesus gains his miraculous powers by learning the forbidden name of God. Well, you know, that's and then later on, well, look, we don't know what it means, so let's just never say it. We'll let the high priest say it on the Day of Atonement in the Holy of Holies. I mean, that's gotta be okay, but short of that, who knows? But all I said was, this halibut is good enough for Jehovah. Can't say that. Let's see. Of course, Islam its prohibition of imagery is taken right from Judaism. A lot of stuff in Islam is just borrowed from Judaism. Early Christians, that I don't know about. I don't think images of Jesus go back all that early, but in the first, I guess in the 2nd and 3rd century you have them. I suppose they figured that commandment was part of the Torah that was unique to Jewish identity and culture and did not feel themselves bound by it. Okay, yeah, but the Bible itself tells us that all the elaborate imagery in the Temple of Solomon was borrowed from the temple furnishings and decor of the temples of Tyre. Solomon got Hiram, the king of Tyre, to bring in his artisans and so forth. So maybe that was, and since they later considered Solomon an apostate, there must have been people who thought that was apostasy, idolatrous syncretism, just as it was when he had out-and-out pagan temples built in Israel to accommodate all of the foreign wives, the princesses of different countries that Solomon married in order to create alliances with their countries. Later Jews look back and said, oh, this guy had a good beginning, but he wound up an idolater. And even in the speech attributed to Stephen in the book of Acts, what does he say about the temple? Well, God doesn't dwell in such places, and he implies very strongly that the temple itself was an idol. So there must have been some people that kept alive the awareness that there was a huge problem squaring all the iconography associated with the temple and the ark and all that with the no imagery commandment. Personally, I think we hear about in von Rad and other Old Testament scholars that, boy, wasn't it great that Israel alone in the ancient world had an aniconic approach, no image. I think that's some kind of sleight of hand. It seems to me that all presupposes this development toward the Deuteronomic theology, where you could no longer have God making man out of the clay of the ground, God himself giving the Torah, inscribed by his own finger, God actually speaking from the burning bush. No, must have been an angel, because God had become too transcendent to dirty his hands, literally, and that they figured the same thing here. Okay, there were some images of something, but couldn't have been God. Oh, no, they knew that God could not be depicted. I think, again, that's a later notion read back in. But I am not an Old Testament scholar, so I welcome correction. I welcome correction even with New Testament stuff. Okay. Though I guess I do qualify as a New Testament scholar. It would be. Here's one, a nice epistle. Raphael, your brother in geekiness, to the Geeks Church in North Carolina. Peace be unto you. As I was listening to the Geeks' utterances driving by the jungles of South America, a few questions passed through my mind relating to some recent developments in Brazilian megachurch activities. Oh boy, this is interesting. One of Brazil's biggest Pentecostal churches is the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, with about 9 million followers around the world, mainly in Brazil and a few African countries. They recently stepped up their game in the megachurch business by building a huge replica, quote-unquote, of the Temple of Solomon in downtown Sao Paulo. The temple isn't even that big for a megachurch, for megachurch standards. It only seats 10,000 people, but the whole temple complex occupies a huge area. Reading about this prompted in me the following thoughts. Boy, that is pretty spiffy, I gotta say. One, what is the current scholarship about the historicity of the first temple? It seems clear to me that we can question the existence of a king called Solomon, powerful and well known as the Bible purports him to be, or that he built a temple as famous as the Bible tries to imply. But is there evidence for a temple in Jerusalem that was destroyed by the Babylonians or by other invaders and then rebuilt by the Persians? Was it a temple dedicated exclusively to Yahweh, or was it a polytheistic temple like many others in the region? Was it the center of a cult that we would recognize as a precursor to the Jewish religion? Okay, two matters here. The way the Temple of Solomon is described in the Old Testament, especially in the stories of Hezekiah and Josiah reforming it, makes it absolutely clear that there were several gods with their own chapels in the Jerusalem temple. And one king would kick out the non-Yahweh gods, and the next one would bring them back in. Raphael Patai counted it up in his terrific book, The Hebrew Goddess, and said that Asherah, the bride of Yahweh, was worshipped in the temple on and off, for totaling 2/3 of the time the temple stood, according to the Bible itself, when it says, this king kicked out the worship of Asherah, this one brought it back in, this one reigned so many years. It's pretty clear. They had all kinds of gods worshipped in there. Nehushtan, the sun god, the hosts of heaven, etc., etc. And the way it's depicted, and Margaret Barker's books about the temple make this very, very clear. But you don't even need to do that. You can just see from the Deuteronomic history that was the case. But the big issue, in my opinion, is, are they talking about the possibly imaginary Temple of Solomon, or the second temple that Zerubbabel had built, supposedly rebuilt? I wonder if that was the original first temple, and the second temple was Herod the Great's total revamping and hugely expanding of it. I wonder if that might be the case, because there is no archaeological evidence for this grand temple in Jerusalem in 1000 BCE. right? Or for the temple of the palace of David on Mount Zion next to it. There's no evidence. How is that? I mean, no ruins, right? That's what I mean. So that's a little odd if it actually was there. So my hunch is that what they've done is to combine Herod's temple with Zerubbabel's as if they were the same, and say that was the second and Solomon's was the first. And it seems like there wasn't one. In fact, it's been speculated that Solomon was really based on Alexander the Great. Okay. 2, do we actually have any description of the temple that could be used in the construction of an actual replica? Do we have much more than a crude description of the dimensions of the temple? No, I think a lot of it is very, very specific. And there's a couple of different blueprints, right? 3, I suppose. There's the one given in... I guess it's 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles, which supposedly are the blueprints of the Solomonic temple. And then there is Ezekiel's blueprint for the temple that was not used, which is one big reason some disputed the propriety of having the book of Ezekiel in the canon. And then there's Josephus's description. So yeah, people could follow the instructions, and oddly, if they rebuilt what is described as Solomon's temple, they might be building it for the first time, just like Noah's Ark in this Ken Ham Museum. There never was a Noah's Ark, but there will be when they build it. Right? So, okay. 3, the leading bishop of this denomination is now wearing a kippah, a talit prayer shawl, a long white beard, and calling himself high priest of the temple. Isn't this an anachronism? Aren't those garments typical of Pharisaic Judaism? I'd have to check. The garments of the high priest really in the Bible were apparently originally the vestments of the king, who was also a priest, going back to the Melchizedek priesthood in Jerusalem. So nobody else wore that particular combination of goodies. Of course, there's another sense in which it's an anachronism, because Christianity, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans, tended to think, well, God allowed that to happen because the sacrifice of Christ superseded all of that stuff and we don't need it anymore. Though dispensationalist theology said, well, yeah, but that's not all God's going on. He is literally going to fulfill all the promises he made to Israel and to Jews, so there will be another temple and another high priest. Not for Joe Christian, but for Jews, whether Christian or not. It's a little sticky there. But we do have extensive, detailed information about the high priest's garments. Let's see. 4, is there a precedent for this? Do you know of any other church, Pentecostal or not, that tried to revive the temple and move their practices toward Judaism that much? Now, there could be other ones, but all I know of is that there are Christians who want to rebuild the temple and some Jews who are supposedly stockpiling building materials. Of course, this would pull the trigger on the hydrogen bomb if somebody really tried this, because most people think that the site of the temple overlapped that of the Dome of the Rock. And you can imagine the chaos that would entailed if somebody dynamited the mosque to make room for it's not the Dome of the Rock, it's the Mosque of Omar. No, it is the Dome of the Rock. Yeah, it's just not the Kaaba. Yeah, there is a rock there from which Muhammad supposedly ascended on horseback into heaven. Yeah. Okay. some people want to do that. I don't know if there are other models of the temple that people have built. But I didn't know about this one until you mentioned it, so who knows? There are also Christians that are trying to go back to Judaism or the Old Testament instead. I mean, there's some Noachian group that has abandoned Christianity to take the role given to the nations after the flood, not having to keep the whole Torah, but a basic handful of commandments. Then there are Jewish converts to Christianity who decided to really combine the two and build in the Kabbalah and so on. I attended a synagogue service of one of these groups. I mean, there's not Jews for Jesus. These people really went into the Judaism up in New York State many years ago, and I think there are other things like that going on, Messianic Judaism. Jews for Jesus, I mean no disrespect, but in my experience of them, they seem just to be fundamentalist Protestants who converted from Judaism and use things like the Passover Seder as an allegorical evangelistic pitch for Christianity. Well, this is really Jesus, and this is really the Trinity and all that. But that's not what you're talking about, I think. Okay. Is there a... Yeah, okay. So thanks for a bunch of good questions there. Now, Commander Scotty says, in his book, In Search of Ancient Israel, Philip Davies, is a great book, by the way, everybody ought to read it, asserts that talk of a Deuteronomistic, I prefer the short version, history is meaningless and should be abandoned, thus rejecting the thesis of Martin Note. Do you agree? Yeah, basically I do. Note and others were doing what Davies' fellow minimalist Niels Peter Lemke calls rationalizing or rationalistic paraphrase. They figured, well, all right, there weren't any miracles and all that. There was no famine caused by Elijah, and angels didn't come down to kick the Syrians' butts and all that. No. But we can assume that all the kings were as they're depicted there. Of course, there's been some rewriting there and such, but basically, the skeleton is sound, said Martin Note. Right, the John Bright and the Albright school were even more conservative. Note was, compared to them, called radical, but in light of minimalism, which I espouse, and the utter lack of archaeological evidence for there ever existing a kingdom of Israel or Judah, much less until the Assyrian conquest of whatever was in the north and consolidating it into a kind of a state, and no evidence for a united kingdom of Israel and Judah. Most of it has to be fiction. And I don't think... Well, now I'll have to look at that book again by Davies. I'm imagining he means it isn't really a history. I don't know that he rejects the idea of it being a continuous document that's now for editorial purposes chopped into Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. That those are just reference aids, like chapter and verse divisions. But I don't remember that he says that's not even true. I think he's saying it isn't history. But again, I could be wrong. I'll have to check. I'm surprised I don't remember that. I think these minimalists are really terrific, not only in their dissection of what turns out to be legend and fiction, but also in the way they put things back together, what they make of it. Just like if there was no historical Jesus, well, how did Christianity come about? I think we got some pretty viable explanations. They do the same thing, but where did we get the fictional version? And they can explain that pretty well. And do I want to get into... boy, this is pretty long. I think I'll wait till the next time to get into the next questions. Still got plenty of them, but I welcome new questions. I'm always adding them to the list. I'd like to thank all the Bible Geek listeners who have generously donated to me and my family. We do need it. You're great friends of the Geek podcast, though everybody who listens is. And I try to thank everybody individually, but for some reason they've changed something on the GoFundMe setup where I cannot seem to make individual answers to donors, thanking them and so on. And I don't know what's going on there. Maybe I'll figure it out. So if you haven't heard from me and you donated through PayPal, I will be getting back to you. Most of you have. If it's GoFundMe, I don't know. Let me just tell you right now how grateful I am. I don't know what's up with that. But thank you for listening to the Bible Geek, and keep up the good work. I'll see you next time, probably pretty soon. See you next time, probably pretty soon. Time for the Bible Geek again already? Yes, it's me, Robert M. Price. Before I dive back into my latest book I'm working on, Holy Fable, I wanted to chew through some more of those good questions. And first I'd like to just add something to a couple of questions I dealt with on the last couple of shows. It did not occur to me at the time. Reuven asked, I tried to find the email again and I couldn't, but Reuven asked about the story of a particular Hasidic rabbi who was said to have taught Torah to God, and asked what on earth one might make of this. I didn't quite, for some reason, I didn't catch the wording of his question right, and I think now what he was, well, that what I just said was the gist of it. I somehow thought he meant something else. What would it mean for his followers to say that a Hasidic rabbi was teaching God the Torah? Well, I thought about it a little bit, and it occurred to me that it might have something to do, or at least be part of the same thought world as an early story we have somewhere in the Mishnah. I'm sure Reuven would know it instantly, where you have Rabbi Eliezer, who was always sort of a maverick, not exactly a heretic. Plenty of his opinions are preserved in the Mishnah, even though he's always not the one to go with. But I don't know, it's a fascinating thing. Anyway, he's at Yavna, and there's a debate going on as to whether whether an oven should be, I could be wrong, but it's some technicality like this, whether an oven ought to be considered a multi-piece item or a single item, because it's, different plates forged together and so on. It seems like an awful technicality if you're not in that game, but I don't even remember who took what view. It doesn't matter for what I'm getting at. Eliezer took one view and everybody else in the Sanhedrin took the other. And Eliezer refused to concede. And he said, look, if I am right, may the tree outside attest it, and the tree uproots itself and walks some distance and re-roots itself. And the sages say, I'm sorry, the trees have nothing to do with the issue. It's okay, if I am right, may the river outside attest it. And the river changes course miraculously. And says, no, nothing doing. Rivers don't have anything to say on this issue. And then he says, okay, if I am right, let the walls of this house of study attest it. And what do you know? The bricks in the wall begin to collapse. They start leaning over in respect to Rabbi Eliezer, but in respect to the rest of the sages assembled there, it
The Bible Geek was recorded by Robert M. Price and produced by John Felix and Sergeant Jovanovich. Theme song by John Morris. Visit us at robertmprice.mindvendor.com for more info on Robert's projects, purchase Bible Geek merchandise, and click the ever-important Donate button. Send your questions to criticus@aol.com, and be sure to rate and review The Bible Geek on iTunes. Thanks for listening to The Bible Geek. I'm Torrin Atkinson.